Hello there. Welcome to my stroll through Bible history. The last one I did ended at the book of Ruth. I apologise for the very abrupt way that ended, but I found that I said things about Ruth. I think I was tired. I just made some mistakes, and rather than re-record the entire session, I cut the bits that I got wrong at the end of it. I don't like to get things wrong. I like to be as accurate as possible. So we have the love story of Ruth is where we're starting. Ruth lived about 1200 years or so before the Lord Jesus was born. Something about that. So really comparing it to our modern history, for those of us who are English, UK citizens, maybe you know a bit about the history of the UK. Well, 1066 and all that was when William the Conqueror came over from Europe and conquered Great Britain or England, and that was 1066, which was 1,000 years ago, and this is 1,200 years, 1,200 years-ish before Jesus. So it's a long time before Jesus. And Ruth, the love story of Ruth is beautiful, and it describes Ruth the Moabitess, who marries Boaz, who is a Jew, and out of that union, that lovely union, were born Obed, and then Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David, also the father of six other brothers, and David was the youngest, and we know that David was chosen by God to be the second king. And now we got ahead of ourselves a bit, but just to say that Ruth and Boaz were the great grandparents of David. So their story is very important. Now, very important actually when we look at the genealogy of the Lord Jesus, that there are two foreign women involved. The first one is Rahab the harlot, who lived in Jericho, and who helped the spies when they came in and Joshua to beat Jericho. And she is in the bloodline of the Lord Jesus. She was a foreign lady. She was a prostitute. It tells us how much God values each one of us. And then into the timeline of Jesus, into the ancestry of Jesus, comes Ruth, who was a Moabitess, who came to faith through her relationship with her mother-in-law, Naomi, and chose to come to Israel, or the land of Israel, and ends up marrying Boaz and being in the ancestry of King David, and then ultimately of the Lord Jesus. So we reach here, this period, and Samuel comes into the equation. Samuel, and 1 and 2 Samuel tell the story of Samuel and King Saul and King David. There are 2 books of Samuel, and they cover this quite lengthy period of time, probably about 300 years, probably. And it's the early history of the... Samuel was that great last judge and kingmaker prophet who selected Saul to start off with, and then selected David. And the history of that book is quite straightforward. It follows, that book follows the story. There's nothing to add into that, except to say that when David was born, of course, we have to add into and put into Samuel some of the Psalms, because many of the Psalms were written by David, and they are included in Psalms. They're not in Samuel, and so but these 2 books begin to coincide, which is what happens and gets rather complicated in the rest of the history of the Old Testament. So, some things to say about Samuel. The story of Samuel is amazing, and he's a very important character, and he hears clearly from God about how God feels when his people say, we want to be like everybody else. We want a king. Everyone else has got a king. We want a king. And this would not be like the kings we were talking about earlier on in a previous session, in the early days of Abraham and so on, when the kings were kings of just a small city or large town and its area. These kings had developed into kings over larger areas of land, and much larger, much more powerful kings, and the tribal areas that they'd all been settled in were ruled, controlled, guided by judges appointed by God in the period of the judges, and the people wanted to be like the other nations, and so Samuel asks God, and God chooses out Saul. Now Saul is the only king in the history of the Old Testament who is not related to David. He was chosen, he was a Benjaminite. He was chosen because he was a man of great stature, and he was a good leader. He would have been a great king had he not got jealous of Samuel, and he made some mistakes, and God chose out David. Now, some important things about Saul. Saul did not have Jerusalem as his capital. You have to get it fixed into your head. It's very important to understand the history of the Old Testament, to understand that Jerusalem did not become the capital until David went to Jerusalem. So Saul, the first king, Saul had his capital in Gibeah, which wasn't far from Jerusalem, but the town of Jerusalem, or city of Jerusalem you might call it, but city makes it sound much bigger than it was. It wasn't that big. Jerusalem was still in the hands of Canaanite peoples until David took it over. So Saul had his capital in Gibeah, and when David became king, for the first 7 years of his rulership, he ruled from Hebron, and then he took Jerusalem, and that is why Jerusalem is always called the city of David, because he conquered it and he established his capital in Jerusalem. So that hasn't happened yet in our looking at this history of the Old Testament. So if you have a map, have a look at them. If you can have access to a map, have a look at a map which talks about the tribal areas, and you'll see how the land was split up into lots of divisions, each settled with descendants of one particular tribal leader or son of Jacob, who was renamed Israel, a child of Israel. All these different tribal names, you'll see them set out, and then you'll see a United Kingdom map. You call it a United Kingdom map, not because it's Britain, but because it was the United Kingdom of Israel. And then later on, not too much later now, but later on, it divides into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And we need to be very sure where we are geographically when we're looking at the history of the later part of the Old Testament history. So David rules, Saul rules first of all in Gibeah, and we know that David encounters him, and we know that Jonathan, Saul's son, is best friends, really very close friends with David. And then Saul begins to attack David, and David becomes an outlaw, and he gathers together to him men who are also beyond the bounds of law, and wanders about. And all of that history is fairly straightforward as you read through 1 and 2 Samuel. And then we come to the kingdom period. I'm just going to close that up, my reference thing, and take another. My charts, they're wonderful. So we have rough dates for this. There's no definite dating. It is all very rough. because they didn't count their dating the way that we count it, and they didn't have the same number of days in a year that we have. So it's all a bit difficult because time was counted differently, the years were counted differently by different nations, and it's all very complicated. Anyway, but we know that Saul became king round about 1050 BC, and of course we count down in the years towards zero, so it all counts backwards, which is a bit difficult. Anyway, so Saul is king, and for the most part, his main enemy are the Philistines, who lived pretty much where the West Bank is now, the Gaza Strip. Gaza was one of the Philistine towns. There were 5 major Philistine towns. The Philistines were a very powerful people, and they were harassing the descendants of Israel for a long time as they settled, and there were always skirmishes with them. And then Saul dies as a result of a battle, and David is anointed king. That is at the beginning of 2 Samuel. David is anointed king, but while he is king, Ishbosheth, who is the remaining son, Jonathan having died with his father Saul, Ishbosheth is the descendant of Saul, who is in line for the throne, and he is supported by certain people and rules himself in opposition to David, and eventually David defeats him. So David sets up his kingdom in Hebron for 7 years, and then takes Jerusalem and moves to Jerusalem and sets up his kingdom in Jerusalem. And the story of David is very well known, David and Bathsheba, etc. And of course from the relationship with Bathsheba, which was that terrible adulterous relationship which resulted in David murdering Bathsheba's husband Uriah in the battlefield, very sadly. But after that's all sorted out and David repents, and there are psalms that talk about his repentance and fill in some gaps in the story, David and Bathsheba have another son, and that is Solomon. And David has many sons, and we have in the story the rebellion of Absalom, the son of David, who he was very, very fond of, because Absalom felt he should be king. He was older than Solomon, but it's interesting that the kings were not always chosen by being the eldest son of the ruling king. It was by God's choice. Some of them, as it settles down further down in the history, it does settle a bit more, but mostly. So David chose Solomon because God told him that Solomon would be his successor, and Absalom rebels, and there's a terrible moment in the history of David in his life story when he leaves Jerusalem to his son because he doesn't want to fight his own son, and he actually abandons his throne rather than go into battle against his own son. So that brings us really to the end of the United Kingdom as it was, the one kingdom ruled by first Saul, then David, and then Solomon. And before I finish this little episode, I must say that into this history here we must put most of Proverbs, because Solomon wrote Proverbs. Ecclesiastes fits into this period, again written by Solomon, and Song of Solomon, again written by Solomon. Some of the Proverbs were written by other people, but more or less Proverbs fits into this period. Psalms overlaps, because Psalms have some Psalms of David and some Psalms that were written much later on. There are even some Psalms that were written after the exile, which is much, much later in the Old Testament history. So you have to fit these other people in. And I can't remember if I mentioned Job. If I did, forgive me, but we find it very difficult to place Job because there's nothing in the book of Job to link the writing with any particular king or any particular date in history. So we have to leave Job standing alone. Some people think he's very early, written really, really early in the Genesis period, and some people think he's much later. But we can't. There's nothing definitive, because there's no link in that story of Job to anything else. But Job is a fascinating book. It's very cleverly put together. It's a masterpiece work, talking about the most difficult subject that we ever face, really, and that is why does God allow people to suffer? And Job really doesn't answer the question, but he explores it, and it's a good book to read, but it's a very complicated arguments going on with Job. So I'm going to leave it there and say we've reached the end of the period of history when the kingdom was united, and we are going to go into what's called the divided kingdom period, where things get really complicated. Anyway, so thank you for being with me, and I look forward to seeing you in my next history video.